If we are literally just talking about land mass, our largest shared public spaces, just like by volume, are streets and sidewalks. Something like, I think 20% of the public space in the city of Boston is just streets and sidewalks. And so our approach is to look at that shared public space and say, what is the most equitable use of that shared asset? And what is going to provide the greatest public benefit? And when you look at it that way, it's not about, do we keep the parking or get rid of the parking? It's, what is the best way to accommodate someone who might be in a wheelchair? What's the best way to accommodate someone who has 3 small children and they're trying to get around the city? What's the best way to accommodate a family that is biking? And how do we share that space in the most equitable way?
Welcome to another episode of Spilling the Tea, where we dive deep into the issues and innovations shaping the MBTA. I'm Andrew Cassidy of the MBTA's Customer and Employee Experience Department, and today we have the privilege of hosting Stacy Thompson, the Executive Director of LivableStreets Alliance. Under Stacy's leadership, LivableStreets has been at the forefront of advocating for safer, more accessible, and equitable transportation options in the Metro Boston area. Let's explore her journey, the organization's accomplishments, and the vision for the future of transportation in our region. Stacy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the executive director of LivableStreets? What inspired you to focus on transportation in public spaces?
It often surprises people when they hear that I am a transportation advocate, that I have no background in transportation planning. I am not a transportation engineer. I actually came to LivableStreets because I have a degree in social justice, and I care about issues, systemic issues that impact people. And as you know, and as the T knows, someone's ability to move around their community, their ability to get to work, to get to a place of worship, to get to the doctor, is a huge indicator of their quality of life. So for me, transportation has never been about the planning or the engineering. It has been about the people and how transportation impacts their quality of life. And so that's how I landed at LivableStreets. I wanted to do work that would improve people's ability to get around their own communities and to self-determine how and where they will live.
That's fantastic. Was LivableStreets your first experience with transportation advocacy?
Yes, but I do have a background in climate change advocacy as well. So prior to joining LivableStreets, I was at a great organization called Ceres, which actually works with companies and investors in the capital markets on sustainability and climate change issues. And I like to remind folks that the largest portion of GHG emissions in the country comes from the transportation sector. So for me, it was a really natural shift as someone who cares about climate change to look at the transportation sector, because we could replace every single gas-powered vehicle with an electric vehicle, and it will not solve the climate crisis. So the work that I'm doing helps people every day get to where they need to go, but is also absolutely mission critical if we're going to reduce our GHG emissions locally and nationally.
That's incredible. LivableStreets is known for its impactful programs like Vision Zero, Better Buses, and the Emerald Network. Can you share some of the key successes and milestones of these programs?
LivableStreets has been around for 20 years, and we always started from the premise that we're not focused on a particular mode like biking or like transit. We're focused on people and how people use their streets. So in our early days, some of the things that we were most excited about were things like getting the first protected bike lanes in Boston, which came on Commonwealth Ave a little over a decade ago. But another really big win for the organization is working with the MBTA and the city of Boston to put down the city's first dedicated bus lane on Washington Street in 2017. And at the time, this red paint, I mean, literally, it was cones and red paint, seemed like this huge shift to just give space to buses. And now, less than a decade later, we have miles and miles and miles of bus lanes that are moving quite literally thousands of people across the region. And we also have some really incredible center running bus lanes and what I would call pretty cool tricked out bus priority in the region, although we have a long way to go. So it's those small wins where we try to demonstrate what's possible with a small piece of infrastructure that I think have been most impactful to me because you can see the ripple effects over time.
You already kind of touched on this a bit, but you often mention that Livable Streets is an access and equity organization, not just transportation. Can you elaborate on what this means and why it's important?
Again, I think, and I see this for people who care about walking, biking, transit, or moving around their communities in a car, that we often get really hung up on the mode or vehicle that is on a street. Livable Streets wants to flip that on its head. And I like to remind people that if we are literally just talking about land mass, our largest shared public spaces, just like by volume, are streets and sidewalks. Something like, I think 20% of the public space in the city of Boston is just streets and sidewalks. And so our approach is to look at that shared public space and say, what is the most equitable use of that shared asset and what is going to provide the greatest public benefit? And when you look at it that way, it's not about, do we keep the parking or get rid of the parking? It's, what is the best way to accommodate someone who might be in a wheelchair? What's the best way to accommodate someone who has 3 small children and they're trying to get around the city? What's the best way to accommodate a family that is biking? And how do we share that space in the most equitable way? It means that our work includes things like adding green space and trees and benches to our streets. We care about things like public art, and we also care about things like affordable housing. So it's, again, not just about a bike lane or a bus lane or a crosswalk. It's how to make that shared public space something that is good for everyone, and we really mean everyone.
So it's really an intersection of all of the above.
Yeah, we internally call it the messy middle. It's very easy to focus on one piece of a street. It's very hard, but it's important to look at all of the different ways someone can use a street. And what I often say is a little bit like updating a website or even planting a garden. There is no end. If you're someone who loves to garden, you know that you plant seeds and then you have to cultivate and work on that garden, and it changes and evolves over time, and it continues to change, and the plants that you use might change. Our streets are exactly the same. There is no end game. What worked 10 years ago might not work today, and it might not work 20 or 30 years from now. We have to be open to really listening to what people need and be willing to try new and hard things that can sometimes be challenging. And we all know that some of the new infrastructure, not everyone loves or everyone is used to, but it reflects the need of the community at the moment.
That's fascinating. Things are always evolving, and I'm sure even kind of looking at plans that might have existed pre-pandemic and post-pandemic have shifted. Obviously, there's been a boon for people looking for housing in the Boston metro area, and then also with some people working remotely, kind of changing up where and how they use those spaces.
The Boston area, and frankly, the entire state of Massachusetts, is experiencing a housing crisis that is not unique nationally, and it increasingly is not unique globally. But what we know is that most people don't want to spend 2 hours sitting in traffic in a car. That is an almost universally shared experience. I don't want to speak for everyone. There might be 1 or 2 people out there who are like, yes, I love to put my book in, sit in my car. That is my dream. But most people prefer to live close to their job, live close to the other community assets that they want access to. A grocery store, a daycare center, a place to play soccer with your kids, right? Those are desirable. So it's part of the reason why Livable Streets thinks about land use as part of our work, and why we support things like the MBTA Communities Act that seeks to build more housing next to transit. But we also say that the way to make something like the MBTA Communities Act successful is to also consider what assets you're building next to those MBTA stations that will make living there more livable. Will there be a grocery store that's accessible via transit or walking? Will there be safe crosswalks? Will there be parks? Will there be other types of businesses that you can get to? So we try to think about a holistic approach. We try to make sure that when we are supporting new development, that it is both mixed use and mixed income. We'd love to see more affordable housing in Massachusetts. We'd love to see a stronger approach to keeping folks in place and anti-displacement measures overlapping with an increase in both bus service and train service. Because if you don't do all of those things together, it's very easy to leave our most vulnerable populations behind, or quite literally push them out of the MBTA service areas where we, and I say we because I know the MBTA is doing this, trying to provide more service to people who don't own cars and who really need it.
Absolutely. So you kind of talked about this, but affordability and transportation are probably two of the biggest key issues facing the state of Massachusetts, but they're also deeply interconnected. And you talked about some of the positive initiatives that are happening, but what are the real challenges that you're facing in trying to make that more of a reality and kind of move the needle on that?
I think there are two challenges. One is that Massachusetts, like every other state in the country, underfunds transit. And I know that is a challenge for every single transit authority. In addition to the MBTA, there are 15 regional transit authorities across the state. So in a real dollars and cents, we put significantly less money toward transit than we do toward driving. And there are lots of studies that show that. And so, it's hard to get to the system that we know we need when the folks who are responsible for implementing that system don't always have the resources. What I mean by that is, Livable Streets several years ago said we'd really like to see the T purchase like hundreds more buses. That, if we really want to run great service, the T simply needs many, many more buses, many, many more operators to provide appropriate coverage across the entire region. That simply requires resources, and the T can't run the level of bus service that we would consider sort of gold standard best in country without those resources. But we go through these fights every year at the State House about where we're going to put money here and there. And I think not just in transportation, but in any social good, I wish that our elected officials were starting with, what do we want our systems to look like? How much will that cost? And how will we, as the responsible elected parties, get there? Instead of saying, okay, we have $5 to work with. We're going to cut the pie in a few different ways and figure it out, right? That doesn't help folks. I think there's also a public perception that public transit is only for dense urban settings, and that is not the case. The vast majority of transit systems across the country are in rural communities. I think it's something like 55% of all transit systems across the country are in places that we would consider very rural. I grew up in Minnesota, so I sometimes laugh when people talk about the size of Massachusetts. And I'm like, the state I grew up in was much bigger, and transit operated in places that were much, much more isolated. And then I think because people perceive transit as something that only happens in cities, they don't necessarily see it as a viable option in places like the suburbs, where the MBTA does run a bunch of service, and in rural communities in Massachusetts, where our regional transit authorities also run critical service that helps older adults who want to stay in their communities stay in their homes, that help young adults and people with disabilities get to jobs and get to critical social services. Transit systems in Massachusetts are playing a vital economic role in our suburban and rural settings. And the public perception doesn't, I think, always align with that reality.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people don't realize the greater benefit of transit, even if they're in a community that's not served. The benefit of having other people served by it and the opportunity that it provides to fellow residents of Massachusetts and tax money gained by the state by getting people to where they need to go. It's a very interconnected piece where maybe not everyone realizes just how beneficial transit can be.
Absolutely. I often tell folks that if they're struggling with understanding the public good of public transit, to think about public schools and libraries do for our communities. Even if you are someone who, let's say, has an Audible account or likes to go to a bookstore and pay for books, you're probably someone who thinks that a library holds a lot of value, even if you don't go there frequently. Or if you don't have children, most people see the value in us having a public school system because of the co-benefits that those services
Communal
create.
good.
Exactly. And transit is very, very similar. The co-benefits of having an affordable and functional transit system that serves urban and rural communities is almost impossible to count because of the number of social goods that it helps amplify and support.
Speaking of the topic of affordability still, as well as housing, transit-oriented development, or TOD as it's sometimes referred to, is often discussed in urban planning. How does Livable Streets approach TOD, and what improvements do you think are necessary for it to be truly effective?
Something that I like to tell people is that before the advent of the automobile, basically all development in the Boston area and in most urban settings was transit oriented. You had to have jobs and have access and resources that were walkable, that you could get to with a limited means of getting around. And then you saw density pop up as cities invested in public transit at the turn of the century, right? That it actually was sort of a very natural evolution of our urban cores in particular that didn't have a name. And then we got away from that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and are returning to something that we were already doing naturally and intuitively before the advent of urban sprawl. So just like contextually, I think that TOD is talked about as something new or something that we are forcing when it is actually something that is quite natural and quite intuitive in basically every urban setting across the globe. The way that we think about TOD is, again, we want to focus on the people impacted, not necessarily the infrastructure. So transit-oriented development to us is supporting projects that have good multimodal access, but are also really responsive to the populations they're trying to serve. So, for example, I live in a community called Jamaica Plain, and there was a great development that went up in my community that was a dense project that was largely housing for low-income seniors. And that was really valuable to me as someone who wants to make sure that people of all ages can live in my community. But the development prioritized space for seniors over space for vehicles because they knew that a majority of the folks living in that space would not be able to drive for a variety of reasons, and instead made sure that it was very close to an Orange Line stop so that people could get to the Orange Line and then therefore get to the services they needed. So I think that the worst kind of TOD just puts boxes with, one or two bedroom apartments in them next to some transit stop and isn't thinking about the user who's most likely to be in the space. And the best kind of TOD looks at who's going to live there and what are they going to need, and does the community have those things, and how do we think more holistically? I think about grocery stores a lot because they really make or break the health of a community and the ability for people to feel good in their community. And so you can build a ton of dense housing, but if you don't have access to a daycare and you don't have access to a good grocery store, there are a lot of problems. I wouldn't consider that successful TOD. So it doesn't, in a straightforward way, answer your question, but to us, it's a combination of all these things. Or you can have all of those things in a community, but you can put it next to a commuter rail stop where the train only comes once an hour. And so if we can't get that train to come more often, or we can't get bus service to intersect with that commuter rail stop, then people can't access those goods and services on a regular basis. So it's about looking at the entire ecosystem and making sure that as many people can have as many experiences as possible.
That's really interesting to hear, because I've always thought of it as, I guess, probably the more simplistic approach of, building next to it, having some things available. But hearing that thought process of the senior living community, it shows that, you need to have that level of thoughtfulness, because there's a good in it probably regardless, but you can really amplify that good if certain considerations are made.
Absolutely. And I think every project, I like it when folks get really granular. So just using this example, if you have a senior living facility next to a T-stop, if the T-stop doesn't have an elevator or the elevator is chronically broken, that older adult can't access the system. So it doesn't matter if you built the best building on the planet for seniors, a 3-minute walk away from a T-stop, if we haven't made sure that that T-stop is accessible and that we're running service on a regular basis throughout the day, because that older adult is likely not working a 9 to 5. They're probably going to want to get somewhere at 2:00 in the afternoon. If we're not thinking about all of those things as part of TOD, then it's just a nice idea on paper. It's not actually a lived reality.
So as far as creating access, Livable Streets advocates for fare-free transit. Can you explain why this is important and how it could be implemented effectively on the MBTA?
I would like to start by saying that fare-free transit is something that there is a wide range of opinions. So I'm going to share Livable Streets' approach and also recognize that there are probably people who would disagree with us, and that's okay, because that's how things go in most transportation-related conversations. Livable Streets did not take on fare-free transportation until 2020, really the end of 2019. And that's in part because part of our work is talking to MBTA riders and actual people on the ground. And we heard increasingly from folks on the ground that making it free would just make it easier. And we had to start listening to people. And something that is often cited when I bring up why I believe fare-free transit is something that every transit authority should be looking at seriously. Implementation is going to look very different. Every transit authority raises money differently, has different challenges and different needs. But I think that we need to stop pretending that this isn't a viable option for some or many transit authorities. When I bring this up, folks say, every time you survey people, they say that they would prefer reliability for the trains to run more often. And we can use that fare money to do those things. They say that fare-free transit doesn't matter. And what I say is, I have a background in sociology, and what we know is that self-reporting data is the least reliable data you can get. If you ask people how much they exercise, how much TV they watch, they're going to tell you something that's very different than their likely lived reality. And what we've learned from fare-free transit and the dozens of pilots that have happened in Massachusetts is that even when people can afford to pay for transit, they ride it more when it's free. That is happening in Boston, that is happening in Merrimack Valley, that is happening in Worcester, that has happened with almost every pilot that has happened across the state. And when you start to poll people after they've experienced fare-free transit, they say things like, well, when it's free, it's harder for me to take the lift. Or when it's free, it's harder for me to justify driving. So people react differently when the service is actually free. But on a practical level, we have been advocating very specifically for fare-free buses in the state of Massachusetts because 15 of our 16 transit authorities are bus only. So if you make buses free across the entire state, half of the state is only buses, and that makes basically half of the service we're providing free overnight. We've seen tremendous success in Worcester and Merrimack Valley. I would encourage folks who are skeptical to go to those transit systems and see what it's like to get on a bus when you don't have to know how much it's going to cost or where you have to pay for those fares. It takes the friction out of the experience. And both of those systems that are system-wide fare-free and have been for several years now have seen very high ridership and increased ridership. On the MBTA, there are also trains, so it's not as simple, but most people transfer from a bus to a train. So we don't actually see it as necessarily a cost-saving mechanism for everyone because most people are going to end up paying somewhere along the way. But it is a time savings mechanism. So it allows for all-door boarding on all of the buses. It also measurably reduces the amount of conflict between riders and the person operating the bus. This is something that has been measured in systems where there is fare-free service. Operators know that the number one reason they get into conflicts and are assaulted is because of fare disputes. So it takes that friction away from them. And I think really importantly, it takes away the confusion and the step of how do I pay? Where do I pay? And I can't tell you enough how much that deters people from actually riding transit. So at least on the bus system, what we've seen in all of the pilots on the MBTA side is riders do end up saving money, even if they're still taking the train. The buses run faster and the operators experience less friction with the riders. It's a better experience overall. And at the end of the day, if we're getting more people on transit, that is the goal, right? I think that that's important. When people push back and say, oh, this isn't effective or it doesn't solve all the T's problems, I'm not saying it's going to solve all the T's problems. I'm saying it helps increase ridership. It makes it easier to get on the system. And I would encourage people to point to any other solution that has been put out there that has had the same kind of impact on ridership as free transit. Anything. Point to anything that we have spent millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars on that has had the same ridership impact as making fare-free transit a reality. I just don't think that there's an equivalency. So it's not simple. Not everyone agrees, but I think that it is something that we should be putting in our toolkit of one of the many things we should be considering to make our transit systems better. And again, when Livable Streets talks about it, we're talking about every single transit system across the state, not just the T. We're not just picking on the T. We think that everyone should be considering it.
So you make a great case for the societal piece. I know detractors often cite the financial, especially given I can't speak for everyone as far as transit authorities, but I do know that the MBTA is facing a financial cliff. How does this interrelate with that?
This is where I like to put my myth busting hat on. So in 2020, Livable Streets did an analysis of how much it would cost for the T. And again, we have been very clear that we are not advocating for making the entire MBTA free overnight. We know that that would be a very challenging hurdle. What we focus on is local buses. So not the Silver Line and not every express bus, right? But think the 39, the 28, those buses, that type of bus, making those buses free. Adjusted for transfers, meaning that a vast majority of bus riders then, after they ride a free bus, get onto a part of the system that costs money. The T collects less than $30 million annually from people who only ride a local bus and don't actually get on another part of the system that charges. And for context, $30 million is about 5% of the money that is collected in fares. And fares only accounts for 20% of the operating budget. So 5% of 20% is how much money we're talking about. And then you're not accounting for the potential cost savings of not having to update and repair fare vending machines on buses, not having to spend millions of dollars on fare enforcement on those buses, and not having to, in some cases, hire additional bus operators, because we've seen so many cost savings in helping the buses move more quickly that you can sometimes actually run more service without purchasing more buses and hiring more operators. Not always, but sometimes. So to us, it's actually really cheap. It's not a one-to-one. There are other variables, but it isn't the kind of budget busting solution that people think it is. There are many other things that cost a heck of a lot more in the system.
Definitely interesting things to noodle over for the powers that be.
I think we could have an entire conversation just about the math and how we get there. And do you count having to hire more operators and purchasing more buses as part of the overall cost, right? If we know definitively that free buses force us to run more service, then do we have to add the added cost to that or not? We say no, because the MBTA has set goals of increasing service and has set goals of having more buses and running more service through the bus network redesign process. So we say you're already planning on doing these things. They should be part of the capital and operating budget already. We are just helping you get more riders by making the service free. But I think that that is where the nuance and complexity is really important, and where we would acknowledge that it is not as simple as just like taking the fare boxes off and calling it a day on the T side. We still think the T should try it. We still think it would be a really valuable experiment to go system-wide fare-free bus for a while to see what the impacts are before fully implementing the new fare collection system. But I understand why there are lots of folks inside the system who say, whoa, we don't know how we feel about that. And there are complications that you might not be thinking of. What I would say is, I hope people continue to keep an open mind. And I hope that we can continue to experiment and collaborate together on what I think is a good solution.
Thanks for sharing all that. That's a lot to consider.
Yeah, I know it was a bit long-winded, but it's a hefty topic.
It is. And it's good to get an expert opinion on it. Shifting gears a little bit, the MBTA back in, I believe, November of last year launched its track improvement plan as a means of addressing the multitude of slow zones throughout the system. We're well on our way at this point, but each one of these requires, usually a diversion, sometimes significant, multiple weeks, what have you. What is the role of Livable Streets with taking on these diversions and helping communities prepare?
One thing that I would say, especially coming out of a fare-free bus conversation, is that at the end of the day, most transit advocates and most people that work inside the T want the exact same things, and that we are actually aligned in our goals. And something that we have wanted on both sides for a long time is an appropriate level of investment in repairing our system and getting it to a good state of repair. So I would say that a lot of the time it's my job to push you all to move faster, work harder, think creatively. But sometimes it's the role of advocates to move with the T. And so when the leadership at the MBTA let us know that they were planning a full year of diversions and that they were going to move very quickly, frankly, probably much more quickly than we would have pushed them from the outside to move, we put our partnership hats on and said, our job is to help the people that we engage with understand what's going on, not just so that they continue to get where they need to go, but so that they can understand the benefits of taking this approach. We're talking about decades of disinvestment in the system, which frankly, if you're an everyday rider, you might not understand or you might not care. You're just upset that it took you an extra 45 minutes to get somewhere on a shuttle. So all of this is to say is we've seen our role is working with the MBTA and the city of Boston to let people know when diversions are coming. We've had folks on our team helping build supplemental materials and multilingual materials, in addition to what the T is doing in communities like East Boston and in Dorchester when the Blue Line was shut down and the Red Line was shut down. We've had partners at groups like Bikes Not Bombs and the Boston Cyclists Union lead rides for people who are choosing to not take the system during the shutdown, but to choose an alternative mode that's not driving a car. That has been a really important element of these diversions and shutdowns, is to help people understand that, especially if they don't own a car or they don't have a job where they can work from home, that getting on a blue bike or taking a bike is an option for those who are able-bodied, and that we have great community partners who can help you do that if you're nervous about getting on a bike or you don't quite know what the route looks like. So we've been working with partners to help with that kind of supplemental outreach. And then we've also been surveying riders during and after diversions to understand what went well and what could be improved. We know that the MBTA is consistently seeking feedback. We also know the communication isn't perfect. So part of our role is to then give that feedback to you and say, hey, in the future, this is how you should consider doing signage differently. Hey, in the future, you might want to train your ambassadors to share this type of information or get out there a few days earlier so that every time we do a diversion together, it gets a little bit better.
And we do take a look at those. They end up in my inbox and we pore over them as a group. We look for do outs and, again, whatever we can do to improve. And I suppose on the topic of improvement, I'm just curious as to how do you view the MBTA as it stands today? What grade would you give it?
I think that I would give the T a B-.
Okay.
But that is up from a failing grade.
All right.
What I would say is what I've seen is an incredible amount of effort. I've talked to almost no one inside the T, and there are quite literally thousands of employees who aren't working really hard and who aren't trying really, really hard. And it is so challenging to do that kind of labor when everyone's mad at you and consistently mad at you. Yeah. And to continue to have good morale and continue to wake up every day and then just get yelled at when you're trying that hard is really tough. But the T is still playing catch up, right? So as an advocate, I can't give an A for effort. I have to say I'm excited to continue to partner with the T because I can see that the work is there. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of communications. I think that there's a lot of work to be done on the bus system. I think that I would love to support the T in continuing to hire more people who can move this work forward. And I think that we've been so stuck in our problems that we haven't had a moment to step back and say, where do we really want to be in 10 years? Are we going to be running train service that comes every 5 minutes, peak or non-peak? Are we going to be serving thousands of more bus riders with peak frequency across the system? Who do we want to be as a region? Where do we want to get to? I want to see the T start talking about those bold visions because that's how we get the grade up and that's how we start moving in a forward direction.
So looking ahead, what are the goals and initiatives for Livable Streets? How do you see the organization evolving over the next few years?
10 years ago, Livable Streets did not have a transit program at all. And now it's probably half of our work. I think that we will continue to do what we always do, which is focus on people and less on modes. But I think that the organization, with some great upcoming leaders who are on my team, are really continuing to lean into those intersectional questions. And I think that our work will increasingly center environmental justice, center the impacts of displacement, and center the people in our region and in the MBTA region who are most transit dependent and making sure that their perspective is included in the conversation. What that will look like in terms of advocacy and if we are partnering with the T or pushing the T, only time will tell, right? But I don't think that the organization is going to stop approaching our work with a people-centered lens.
What advice would you give to other cities or organizations looking to implement similar transportation and public space initiatives?
I think that I would start by saying that there's almost no community across the country where the status quo is going to be sustainable in terms of our streets. I can't think of a place that I've gone that has figured it out. And starting with that premise means that whether you're an advocate or a city official, that it's really time to start getting experimental and being willing to make hard changes that will upend the status quo and get us to a better place. It's so easy to say this is how things have always been. Our community has always looked this way, but it's not working. We have a problem. We don't have affordable housing. A lot of Americans are unable to get to healthcare services, unable to get to jobs, unable to take their kids to daycare. So we have to do something differently, and we have to be willing to make those bold, hard decisions. And I guess to folks in the advocacy community and the city, as we are looking to do bold, hard things that might go against our instincts, things like fare-free transit, but also things like center running bus lanes and investing more in bike infrastructure, to also be willing to step back and listen to the community members that are going to be most impacted and really contextualize the work that you're doing. And then recognize that even if you are fighting with each other, you probably want the same things. Everyone wants to be able to get around their community. We have found at Livable Streets that when we hold those values and know that the folks inside government are often trying their best and often want the same things, it's a lot easier to work together to get those bold, transformative projects on the ground and to move together. So I guess the takeaway is be willing to be brave and be willing to give the person on the other side the benefit of the doubt. As long as you're both trying to move in the same direction, you're going to get farther that way.
How can the community and our listeners support Livable Streets and get involved with your advocacy efforts?
That's a wonderful question. You can go to our website at LivableStreets.info, not .org, not .com, .info. We have some newsletters. We also have a street ambassador program where you can volunteer to do some of the outreach that we do to transit riders and community members. It's one of our most successful and most impactful programs, and people really enjoy doing the work. So you can sign up to volunteer. We also have events. We have an event coming up at the end of September called Tour de Streets. That's a ride and a walk. It's located in Alston, and it's a great way to get to meet other advocates and also just have a very chill ride or community walk. So if you're one of those folks who's a little nervous about biking or sees some of those big bike or walk-in events that are a little intimidated, this one's a little smaller and easier to access. And we also have an event called the Street Talk 10 and 1 that happens every December. The general manager participated last year. It's a great way, again, to meet other people who like advocacy or interested or curious about transportation of all varieties. So lots of ways to get involved.
Stacy, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this insightful episode of Spilling the Tea. Stacy Thompson's unwavering commitment to access, equity, and sustainability in transportation has illuminated the vital intersections between public transit, housing, and community well-being. To our listeners, thank you for your continued support and engagement. Your feedback and questions inspire us to delve deeper into the intricacies of our transit system. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Spilling the Tea on your preferred podcast platform. Join us next time for more exclusive insights into the MBTA. We value your input, so if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us at social@mbta.com. We love hearing from you and incorporating your ideas into the show. Until next time, I'm Andrew Cassidy, and this has been Spilling the Tea.